Today we are talking about compost. Compost is one of the most important pieces of organic sustainable gardening and farming. This is the best way that we can add organic matter back to our soil is through compost. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to build a hot compost pile, I'd like to take a moment to just marvel at the incredible ability of our natural world to take our waste, right? So our plant material, everything that's coming from the earth that dies, and take this material and take something like this and turn it into rich, beautiful compost, which can then grow our next season of plants. Compost really is proof that life exists after death. So what do we need to start our compost pile? So when we're building a hot compost pile, so this is when we want to get that temperature up from the microbes in the pile actually releasing metabolic heat in the process. And this does a couple things, right? So this makes our pile a faster pile. Everything breaks down quicker. And then also we end up with a better finished product that has more life and activity in that diversity of the ecology of that pile than if we were to do other methods of composting. So what we're gonna do today is I'm gonna kind of show you how to build a compost pile using the lasagna method. So I have a few layers already laid down here, and I'm going to add some organic matter to it. So after things grow in the garden, right, we need to pull them out and make way for the next round of plants. Right now, it's late summer, early fall, and we are pulling out all of our tomatoes and cucumbers and plants that have been growing all summer long that have finished their life cycle, and we're ready to put in our broccoli and cauliflower and carrots for the season. And so what we do with that green waste is we bring it over here to the compost pile and we break it down. So the first step that we can do is to actually break up that plant material. And we can do this a couple ways. We can chop it up using clippers and chop it up into about 3-inch pieces. Or we can also use a leaf or wood chipper to break down that plant material. So we have a eco shredder here at the Forage Garden that we often use to break down our green waste. And then we're trying to get the right food sources for our bacteria in the pile to start that breakdown process. We want to create the right environment for our bacteria and microbes in our compost pile to properly break it down. And what they need is they need food, air, and water. And their food source, so this is really important, they require the correct carbon to nitrogen ratio in that compost pile. And that ideal ratio is 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And as gardeners, we don't necessarily know exactly what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is of different plant material, but we can get a good guess based on identifying a few factors that are part of that plant. So we break plant material and green waste into 2 categories. We have brown material, so this includes things like straw, hay, dried leaves, wood chips, sawdust, newspaper are all gonna fall under the carbon-rich materials. So brown material. And this generally has a ratio of about 120 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. On the other end of the spectrum, we have our nitrogen-rich material. So this includes things like food scraps, anything coming out of your kitchen, grass clippings, leafy greens, so any leafy plants that are coming out of the garden. It also includes coffee grounds, manures, are all gonna have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So they're gonna have about 10 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So if we balance these two materials, putting a bit more of that green material in there, we should get a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. So what we have today is we have some straw from the chicken coop. So this is straw that is also mixed with chicken manure. And then we have some leafy greens from the garden that we've chopped up. And we have some dried plants that we've also chopped up. So the reason we chop up this plant material is to increase the surface area to allow for the bacteria to enter the plant material more quickly and start that breakdown process. So what we're going to do is we're going to layer our plant material, green material, brown material, make sure that it's nice and wet. So that's the next thing that our microbes need is water. We want to make sure the pile is thoroughly saturated with water. The ideal is to have it as wet as a wrung out sponge. So not sopping wet, but not totally dry. We want something kind of evenly moist. We are going to stick a thermometer in it and wait. And what we should see is within about 24 hours or so from when we start the pile, we should see an increase in temperature. Generally, we're hoping that it hits about 130 degrees Fahrenheit to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. That tells us that our bacteria are starting to break down that green waste and releasing metabolic heat in that process. After a week or so, we'll likely see that temperature drop, and that indicates that the bacteria have used up many of their food resources and likely much of the oxygen in the pile. So they also need air. And at this point, what we need to do is we need to turn our pile. So flipping it, in our system, we flip from one side to the next, or we could turn it in place. And what we're doing is incorporating oxygen into the center of the pile, and then also mixing up all of our green waste so that there's more food sources for our bacteria to continue that breakdown process. After we've turned the pile and made sure it also has the right moisture content in there, we're gonna see again a spike in the temperature. Again, this is likely going to be the highest temperature that we see throughout the course of this pile. We'll continue to, as it drops, we'll turn it, drops, we'll turn it, and eventually that temperature will reach the temperature of the soil out in our garden. So depending on the time of year that is, that will change. Troubleshooting your pile. There's a couple things that can go wrong when you're building a compost pile. So one is that we do not see a spike in temperature. So the pile does not heat up, and we do not see any activity going on in that compost pile. So what's happening there is likely one of two things. Either we do not have the correct carbon to nitrogen ratio, likely we have more carbon, so too much of that brown material is in there and not enough of the green material. Or we haven't given the pile enough water. So one of those two things is going wrong there. So what we could do is we could add some more green material, water the pile, mix it up, and see what happens then. The other really common problem that we see happen is that the pile becomes anaerobic. And this is something that happens a lot at home gardens where folks are trying to take their food scraps and prevent that from going in the landfill, which is great, and compost at home, but they're not generating the carbon-rich material that is needed to build a healthy compost pile. And so what's happening is they're putting all that nitrogen-rich material, all the green material from their kitchens into the pile without the carbon source. And what happens in that process is that it becomes anaerobic and it starts to release methane gas. And this is when we see stinky, gross compost piles. So if that's ever been an issue for you, what you need to do in that situation is get a carbon source. So it's very doable to take your food scraps from your kitchen and compost them right in your home, but you need to be adding in dried leaves, you need to be adding in some newspaper or other paper products maybe that are coming from your home. And if you can't find carbon sources in your backyard or in your home, you could purchase some straw or hay to add to that compost pile. And as long as you just throw some on there when you're adding in your food scraps, you're likely gonna have a much less stinky pile and allow for that proper breakdown process of your plant material.